Racism is a deep-seated issue that has plagued humanity for centuries. It is a word that carries immense weight, a word that conjures images of pain, suffering, and injustice. But what exactly is racism? Where did it come from? And how has it evolved over time? In this video, we'll dive deep into the history of racism, exploring its origins, its impacts on societies across the globe, and how it continues to shape our world today. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe, like this video, and share it to as many people as possible. Let's get into it. To understand racism, we need to go back to the very beginnings of human civilization. Racism, in its most basic form, is the belief that one race is superior to another. Before this belief took root, humans lived in tribal societies where fear and mistrust of the other were primarily survival instincts rather than a structured ideology. The concept of race as we know it today didn't exist in ancient times. Instead, people identify themselves based on tribe, religion, or region. The ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, for example, made distinctions between people based on their cultural and religious practices, rather than skin color. However, these civilizations also engaged in practices like slavery, which laid some of the groundwork for later racial hierarchies. One of the earliest documented forms of racism can be traced back to the caste system in ancient India. Although primarily based on social and religious hierarchy, the caste system began to take on a racial dimension over time. Skin color, or varna, became associated with caste, leading to a form of colorism that persists in parts of the world even today. As civilizations grew and expanded, the need to justify the subjugation of others became more pronounced. Religion played a significant role in this. During the Middle Ages, Christian and Islamic texts were often interpreted in ways that justified the enslavement and discrimination against non-believers. The concept of heathens and infidels became intertwined with ideas of racial superiority. With the Age of Enlightenment came the rise of science, and with it, the misuse of science to justify racism. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the development of scientific racism, a set of beliefs that used flawed scientific methods to classify human beings into different races, with some races deemed inherently superior. Thinkers like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who classified humans into 5 races, and the infamous Charles Darwin, whose work was later misinterpreted to support ideas of racial superiority, were instrumental in spreading these dangerous ideologies. These pseudo-scientific ideas were used to justify European colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Europeans viewed themselves as civilizing the lesser races, leading to the exploitation, subjugation, and dehumanization of millions of people across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The 15th to 19th centuries marked one of the darkest periods in human history, the age of colonialism and the Atlantic slave trade. During this time, European powers colonized vast territories in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. They enslaved millions of Africans, forcibly transporting them across the Atlantic to work on plantations in the New World. This system was built on the belief that Africans were an inferior race suited only for manual labor. This isn't true. But even in the face of such brutality, resistance was never far behind. Enslaved people rebelled, abolitionists fought tirelessly, and over time, the anti-slavery movement gained momentum. The abolition of slavery in the 19th century was a monumental step forward, but it did not, I repeat, it did not mark the end of racism. Instead, racism evolved, taking on new forms in the post-slavery era, which we'll get into in a minute. The 20th century saw the formalization of racism into laws and policies, most notably in the United States and South Africa. In the US, the Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation, disenfranchising African Americans and subjecting them to systemic discrimination. In South Africa, apartheid became the law of the land, institutionalizing racial discrimination and ensuring white supremacy. However, the 20th century was also a time of resistance and change. The civil rights movement in the US, led by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, challenged the status quo and fought for equality. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela and countless others stood up against apartheid, eventually leading to his downfall in the 1990s. The impact of racism has been profound and far-reaching. It has created deep social and economic divides that persist to this day. In many countries, people that are not white face higher rates of poverty, lower access to education and healthcare, and systemic discrimination in the workplace. The psychological toll of racism is so immense, leading to feelings of inferiority, trauma, and a loss of identity. Research shows that racism affects not only those who are directly targeted, but society as a whole. It fosters division, perpetuates inequality, and hinders social and economic progress. The fight against racism is not just about achieving justice for those who are oppressed. It's about creating a more equitable and harmonious world for everyone. Racism today may not always be as overt as it was in the past, but it is still very much alive. In some cases, it manifests in subtle ways through microaggressions, implicit bias, and institutional discrimination. In many cases, it is shockingly blatant, as seen in the rise of hate crimes and resurgence of white supremacist movements. Social media has become a double-edged sword in the fight against racism. On one hand, it has amplified racist rhetoric and allowed hate groups to organize more easily. On the other hand, it has also given a voice to the marginalized, enabling movements like Black Lives Matter to gain global traction. The fight against racism is far from over, but there is hope. Education, activism, and solidarity are key to dismantling racist structures and creating a more just world. Will that happen? It's important to recognize that racism is not just a black and white issue. It's a global problem that affects people of all colors, creeds, and backgrounds. To conclude, we all have a role to play in this fight, whether it's educating ourselves and others, standing up against injustice, or supporting policies that promote equality. Every action counts. Let's work together to build a world where everyone is truly equal, where the color of your skin doesn't determine your worth or your destiny. If you found this video informative and thought-provoking, please like, share, and subscribe, and see you in the next one.